Let's do this.
Take a seat, my horror hounds. The Leprechaun is making rounds. From grassy knolls and Irish Springs to the streets on a hunt for bling. Okay, I admit it, that was pretty bad, but in my defense, I haven't been able to stop talking in rhyme since I watched the year 2000's Leprechaun in the Hood, which not only is a completely outside the box film for this franchise, it also somehow fits right in with it. The fifth movie in the Leprechaun series, In the Hood takes a wisecracking and menacing leprechaun as he once again schemes and murders his way to retrieving his beloved pot of gold. Or, in this case, a golden flute.
I'll take it from you, homie. You'll see. 'Cause you know the Lep is the real OG.
Fans of this franchise all have our own rankings when it comes to which Leprechaun films are too cheesy, which ones aren't cheesy enough, and which ones are just right. But one thing seems to be consistent across the entire scope of this particular franchise. It's fun to watch with people. When you're stoned. And while you may find this movie to be too much and at times too little, I think the fact that it exists and that there's any audience for it really makes it worthy of being broken down here on the show. Also, Tyler and Lance thought it would be funny to make me watch this movie, so there you go.
Better not be wasting my time.
For those uninitiated in the franchise, Leprechaun began with the 1993 film, which followed Lubden the Leprechaun on a hunt for his pot of gold, which he believes had been stolen by Jennifer Aniston? The original film was written as a straight-up blood and guts horror film, but was later reworked to include more comedy and surrealism in the kills, which quickly became the standard for the subsequent catalog of movies. But we're not here to break down Lubden's adventures in North Dakota, although let me know if you'd want to watch that. Instead, we're here to follow his first trip to South Central and see what kind of trouble we can get into when his magical flute is stolen by the cop killer himself, Ice-T.
Finally got your ass. Now where's my goddamn flute?
So, roll one up, pour one up, or whatever it is that you do. I'm Kier with JoBlo Horror Originals, and you're watching Deconstructing. Leprechaun in the Hood stars the iconic Warwick Davis as the titular Leprechaun. This is right up there with some of Davis's most memorable characters, and despite how you feel about this movie, his performance is always exactly what it needs to be with the material he's given.
Did somebody say blow? Hallelujah.
The story goes like this. Ice-T plays Mac Daddy Onassis, a hip-hop artist with dreams of making it big time. When he discovers an underground room full of valuable treasure, he loots the joint and ends up reawakening the Leprechaun. After a hilarious, and I do mean hilarious, scuffle, complete with Mac pulling a baseball bat out of his afro, he's then able to mollify the Leprechaun, turning him to stone and keeping him as a trophy?
Got your ass! Woo!
Hilarious opening scene, by the way, but cut to 20 years later and Mac hasn't aged a day.
Shoot your motherfucking homeboy in the face type shit, alright?
Okay. Mac is now a successful record executive and producer at his own label. Along come our three main characters, Post, Stray, and Butch. These guys are aspiring local rappers who want to make it big time by spreading positivity and unity in their community. You get it? Unity in your community?
Fucking
Fuck.
That shit is whack, alright?
So these guys get rejected and they decide that they're gonna rob Mac's office for revenge. This results in them accidentally nearly killing Mac and reawakening the Leprechaun once again.
Unhand me gold, you thieving hoods. You got more loot than Tiger Woods.
From here, it's pretty much the typical setup. Lubden will not rest until he tracks down his flute and gets revenge on those who took it from him, in some of the cheesiest but most fun ways imaginable. Now, technically, this isn't much different from the plot of, like, any of the Leprechaun films, so why is this installment among one of the most memorable? In order to find out, we're going to be breaking down this movie into our 4 key categories. First, we're going to cover the origins of the movie and how it got made. Seeing as there were 4 other Leprechaun movies before this one, I'm mostly just going to give you the highlights and stick to the origins of this movie. But after that, we'll get into the film's legacy, and trust me, it's more interesting than you would think for a sequel. After that, we'll have some fun with a game of JoBlo Horror Movie Trivia, and then we'll go for the gold and talk about the movie's X Factor, where I find the one small thing that makes this movie such a cult hit after nearly 25 years.
Kinda like Robin Hood. Instead, we're gonna be robbing in the hood.
So, if you're ready, then keep your backs to the wall and don't forget to drop a like on the video. And let's hit play on Leprechaun in the Hood. Let's go back to the early 90s for a minute. A writer named Mark Jones was working as a writer on a show called Superboy. You know, that was the short-lived Superman nepotism series starring Alexander Salkind. Moving on. Jones aspired to be a filmmaker and wanted to write and direct his feature. He had been developing an idea since the 80s after being inspired by a box of Lucky Charms. His idea was an evil, murderous leprechaun who would do anything to get his hands on a pot of gold.
The wee people have their magical ways.
After writing his horror thriller Leprechaun script, Jones was able to get it picked up by Trimark and secure a budget of about $1 million. In fact, this became Trimark's first film to be released in movie theaters. Jones would be satisfied with the film he made, but he didn't want to return for any of the sequels.
I'm starved. Haven't eaten in 10 years.
He made his movie and then went back to working in TV. Only to bring back the creative juices a few years later with Rumpelstiltskin. If you guys want to see me deconstruct that, I'm sure Tyler and Lance would find it hilarious. As for Leprechaun in the Hood, this movie was released as part of that rapid release schedule with a new Leprechaun adventure hitting the direct-to-video shelf every year or two. The sequels were all low budget and occasionally low effort, but the character and his iconic status carried this franchise well into cult status. So, the movies just kept getting made. Leprechaun in the Hood was given a budget of $1.4 million and made use of mostly no-name actors. The money was well spent on practical effects that, big shock, hold up better than the movie's very dated digital effects. However, I will say that director Rob Spera and writers Doug Hall and John Huffman found a way to capture Warwick's best acting sensibilities and just play to his strengths. How did they do that? They basically just let Warwick Davis be the Leprechaun. And that was enough. In fact, if anything is proof that this movie had something going, it's that it got a direct follow-up sequel called Leprechaun Back to the Hood in 2003. Okay, actually, maybe this is the movie that doomed the entire franchise.
Was it all worth it in the end?
But in his wake, Jones left a franchise that would go on and just keep going. Which reminds me, let's take a look at this movie's legacy. After the release of Leprechaun in the Hood, TriStar decided that they couldn't afford to keep pumping money into a property whose glory days were well behind it. They sold the rights to Lionsgate, who immediately began working on the next installment, only to sort of bastardize the history of the original movies and lead to the next films being an attempt to reboot the franchise.
I taught him everything he knows. Oh, yeah.
There have been some rumblings throughout Hollywood that there's a Leprechaun reboot coming our way soon, and even some directors and writers that are attached to the project. If you believe everything you read online, that is. Just kidding. You know what? Actually, it'll probably happen. But as it stands, this movie right here is one of the most iconic ones. And why? Because it's absurd. Between the ghetto puns, the awful rhymes from Post and his friends, the insane continuity errors, and the weird scene of the Chinese restaurant owner trying to audition as a backup dancer,
Chow do the funky peasant. Chow get down hard with his bad self.
this is just one hell of a memorable movie. I mean, at one point, Post and Butch dress in drag to pretend to be hookers in order to confront Lubden at a nightclub. I cannot stress this enough. This movie just swims in bizarre.
Sit down, my healthy filly. You're about to meet a club named Billy.
The kills in this movie are actually kind of good though. There's a few that are done off screen in order to preserve the movie's budget, but the stuff that they do show is hilariously bombastic. We get like 3 chest hole kills in this movie and they're all done differently. It is complete lunacy, people. We often think of this movie as Leprechaun meets How High meets Scarface, but with half of the charm of each. But in its attempt to do something different, the movie succeeds in bringing us new kinds of characters into the path of this maniacal monster. We recall seeing Lubden smoke weed with Ice-T and say,
A friend with weed is a friend indeed.
which is a staple meme for horror lovers of the early 2000s. And we have some truly off-the-wall protagonists, with Butch being maybe my favorite dumb friend with a good heart who sacrifices himself for the less interesting lead type trope. The faces he makes, the way he pulls off the plan in the end, the loyalty, he is extremely memorable. R.I.P. Butch.
Man, this ain't just weed, Post. This weed got clovers in it.
Of course, we can't forget Jackie D, the pawn shop owner, who gets taken out by the Leprechaun by way of hallucination and horniness.
Love me, Jackie. Love me, Jackie.
This movie is so fucking ridiculous. Something I wanted to mention during the origin, but it was just too perfect, so I had to save it for trivia. Did you know that Warwick Davis had such bad stomach gas that there were occasional shooting delays on set because he couldn't stop farting?
Curious aroma.
Lance, Tyler, I hope you guys are getting a kick out of this. And before we move on, let's see if you can answer this question. If Leprechaun 3 and Leprechaun in Space director Brian Trenchard Smith would have returned to direct this movie, where would the Leprechaun's adventure have been set? Is it A, an amusement park, B, Ireland in a dystopian future, C, a mental asylum, or D, the White House? Comment your answers down below. Now friends, if you paid attention to this video, you know exactly what the X factor of this movie is. In fact, I may have already stated it or mentioned it. The purpose of this segment is to find the thing that makes the movie we're watching stand out as some kind of classic or cult classic or just a memorable piece of horror cinema. And for me, that's obviously Warwick Davis. But also, when you're stoned. I think it can all be summed up by a text that my friend sent me right after seeing the movie. It reads, I mean, it can't be an accident. They knew that Ice-T pulling a baseball bat out of his hair would be funny, and I laughed. So I guess they achieved what they were looking to do. P.S. Edibles. Seriously.